Chapter 5 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Kodkina. Was it imagination that gave him the idea that the manner of Tanya Korasoff betrayed a sudden inquietude at the mention of the name of the newcomer? He was sure that the fingers which touched his sleeve in warning were trembling as she glanced wide-eyed toward the door into the garden by which Monsieur Kodkina would enter. Who was this visitor? And what his mission? What his power? What his authority? Stepan threw the door open and stood aside, bowing as the visitor entered, followed by Isade and Picard. He was tall, well-built, with blonde hair brushed straight back from a broad, fine brow, below which steel blue eyes appraised the room and its occupants. His nose was straight and well chiseled, and his small brown mustache, carefully groomed, defined rather than concealed the straight, firm line of his rather red lips, which parted slightly as he saw the figure of Roland before him. His glance met the American's, hovered a second, and passed to Tanya, who had risen and stood mute and expectant. The Russian crossed the room quickly to the girl, and taking the fingers she extended, bowed over them and pressed them to his lips. "Tatiana," he said in French, with a deep and pleasant voice. "The days have sped into weeks, the weeks into months since I have seen you." "Grisha Kodkina, you are welcome," said the girl, withdrawing her hand, and as the Russian straightened, turned toward the American, whom she indicated with a graceful gesture. "You are to meet a visitor to Nemi, monsieur. Permit me to present Monsieur Roland." The Russian straightened, and his clear and slightly surprised gaze passed impudently over the American's ill-fitting clothing from head to foot. Roland had a sense that it was the garments which Monsieur Kodkina noted, not the man within them, and had a feeling of being still further ignored when the Russian, after the slightest inclination of the head, which indeed had seemed a part of his cursory inspection, turned again quickly to Tanya. "Where is Kirillo Ivanich?" he asked. The girl leaned with one hand upon the table, her gaze upon the floor. Her voice trembled a little as she replied: "Kirillo Ivanich is dead." Kodkina started violently. "Dead? Ivanich?" He turned a quick look at Stepan and at Roland. "When did this happen?" he questioned eagerly. "And who?" His look, as though impelled, returned to Roland, who had picked up one of the cigarettes of Monsieur Ivanich from the table and was now lighting it, very much at his ease. Roland made no reply, and Tanya, with a gesture of her extended fingers: "It happened but just now, this morning, Grisha Kodkina," she said. "For some days Kirillo Ivanich had been distraught with nerves, in a kind of strange fit of uncertainty. He was frightened. He bade us keep watch upon the tree and what lies below it day and night, and to humor him we obeyed. We did not know what was to happen. Something strange, Grisha Kodkina." As she paused, the Russian looked from one to the other in astonishment and mystification. "Dead? But how? What happened?" "This morning," the girl went on, choosing her words carefully, "he attacked Monsieur Roland in the garden as he was leaving Nemi. Monsieur Roland defended himself and struck." Tanya hid her face in her hands, trembling. "Go on," said the Russian. "There is little else to tell," said the girl, raising her pallid face from her hands. "Kirillo fell. He is dead." Kodkina's gaze sought the eyes of the other men in confirmation. "It is the truth, monsieur. muttered Picard. "We saw. It was a fair combat, but it was written. What happened?" Monsieur Codquin's look passed slowly from one to the other and at last rested on Roland, who met his glance calmly, soberly, without deference, but without defiance. "He tried to kill me, monsieur," he said quietly. "He was dangerous, and so——" He shrugged. "What would you?" He fell and his head struck a stone. The Russian stared a moment. "Then you——" He paused. Roland smiled a little. "It seems, monsieur," he said coolly, "that I am your new priest of Nemi." There was a long silence, during which the Russian stared at Roland more intently, as though correcting a former and mistaken impression. At last he took a pace forward and the eyes of the two men met. "You knew?" he asked. "Nothing," said Roland. "And now?" The American shrugged, but Picard broke in eagerly. "All the conditions have been fulfilled, Monsieur Codquin, all from the first to the last." And while Roland stood silent in good-humored contempt, the Frenchman told all that had happened, including the American's escape from imprisonment and the breaking of the bough. Roland keenly watched all the actors in this drama, the zealous sincerity of the excitable Frenchman, the mystic absorption of Stepan, the fixed burning gaze of Isade, sure that those who played the minor parts were committed beyond question to a strict interpretation of the symbols of the order. Tanya, the color coming slowly into her cheeks, answered briefly and clearly the questions that were put to her. If there had been restraint in her acceptance of this successor to Ivanich, or wonder at the strange chain of facts which linked this matter of fact American with the destinies of Nemi, she spoke now with an air of definite assurance and fatalism which went far to convince Roland that, if she were not sincere in her beliefs, she was playing a skillful part which warned him how deeply he too was committed to his strange new office. But it was Monsieur Codquin that Roland watched the closest. From an expression of consternation, the face of the Russian settled into a frowning inquiry, and then, as his glance and Roland's met, into a mask-like immobility which revealed nothing of his own state of mind. As one by one the facts were revealed to him, his voice became more quiet, his manner more suave, while he nodded his head in solemn deliberation. The phrases he used were theirs, the jargon of mysticism. And yet to Roland, the man of the world, this change of tone and demeanor failed to comport with the very obvious air of modernity and materialism which Monsieur Codquin had brought in with him from the world outside. "The bough broken," Codquin was muttering. "An escaped prisoner of the Germans. A slave, surely. And the combat? Either one may challenge. The Visconti. There seems no doubt. Yes, it is strange. You say that Monsieur Roland did not know the tradition?" "Not until after Coelho Ivanich was dead," said Tanya calmly. "I told him." "It is most extraordinary," repeated Codquin, turning to Roland with level brows. "An act of destiny, striking as with the hand of God from out of the mists of the eternal ages. But it is a sign too definite to be ignored, an act of revelation and a prophecy." The words were spoken soberly, with an air of rapt introspection, but Roland missed nothing of the alert intelligence of Monsieur Codquin's pale blue eyes, keen and observing, which, unlike Isade, the dreamer's, fairly blazed with objectivity. The impression that Monsieur Codquin was playing a part became more definite. He acted a little too well. The talk of mysticism and destiny fell a little too glibly from his lips to be quite in keeping with Roland's reading of his character, which made the Russian out to be a politician of an advanced type, a doctrinaire perhaps, but an intriguer with a definite and perhaps sordid purpose, who had come expecting to find the dreamer Ivanich, and instead had found a heretic and an unbeliever. But under this skillful camouflage of mere words, which, though they may have meant much to Isard, Stepan, and Picard, conveyed nothing to Roland, he hid his disappointment well. And when all questions had been answered, he went and viewed the dead Ivanich, and agreed, as the others had done, to an immediate interment of the body. Through it all Roland had said little, reading the quick, furtive glances of the girl Tanya, a silent petition to accede in these arrangements. And so, when the orders had been given, Roland returned with Monsieur Kodkina to the room on the lower floor, where Tanya, after a warning glance which Roland interpreted and answered, left the two men to their own devices. Roland, now fully aware that he was to deal with a man of no ordinary ability, took a leaf from Monsieur Kodkina's book and fairly met him at his own game. "An American, monsieur," began the Russian after they had lighted their cigarettes. "It is indeed a far cry from the white lights of Broadway to the priesthood of Nemi." "Ah, you know New York?" asked Roland. "I have been there. An extraordinary city, a wonderful people, intensely practical. But you are no nation of dreamers, monsieur." "Upon the contrary," replied Roland politely. "Were we not dreamers, we should long since have finished disastrously our experiment in individualism. Like you in Russia, we dream, monsieur. But unlike you, our dreams come true." Kodkina gazed at Roland with a new interest. Was this smiling American less stupid than he looked? "Individualism, yes. You are even slaves to liberty, which has made you the mere creatures of your own desires." "You are a monarchist, Monsieur Kodkina?" asked Roland, with an innocent gaze. "May the good God forbid!" cried Kodkina abruptly. "I am a Russian of the heart of Russia, which throbs with the pulse beats of humanity. The Czar has fallen, but the era of absolutism in Russia is not yet over." Roland shifted his knees and fixed a cool look of inquiry upon Kodkina. "I am only a soldier, monsieur," he said. "For a year I have been in a prison camp. As you must see, I am vastly ignorant of what is going on in the world." "Then you must know that my country has changed in nothing but a name. Instead of monarchy, we have oligarchy, a band of men bent upon usurping the rights of the people. The people of Russia are drunk with freedom and accept the new order of things because they think it is what they have long fought for. But the men now in power in the provisional government are not to be trusted. Capitalists, bureaucrats, the enemies of—" "You are a socialist democrat, then, monsieur?" put in Roland. "A friend of Russia's freedom. Call me by whatever name you please." Kodkina shrugged and blew a cloud of smoke. "You mean that there are still those in power who are in sympathy with Germany?" asked Roland. Kodkina rose and walked the length of the room while Roland watched him keenly. "What else? Is it not clear to you?" "I am perhaps dull, monsieur," said Roland vacuously. "Rasputin is dead. The Tsarina has gone. In them, you will admit, the fountainheads of German intrigue have been destroyed. Diverted, let us say, monsieur.
upon the surface, but the evil stream still flows secretly below the ground, to appear in high places where least expected."
Roland rose and threw his cigarette into the hearth. "I have no doubt that what you say is true, Monsieur Codkina. I am not wise. If I am to be of service here——" Roland paused significantly until he found Codkina's gaze. "If I am to be of service here, I must trust myself into the hands of those who have a deeper insight into the politics of Europe than myself. I have promised Mademoiselle Korasoff to stay at Nemi and do what I can. I would like to help." He paused again, and then, with an air of frankness, "Perhaps, Monsieur Codkina, I could do no better than to entrust myself into your hands." Codkina turned half toward him, his fine white teeth showing in a smile, and then thrust forth a hand in confirmation.
"Can it be that you will trust me?"
"Implicitly." Codkina's pale eyes glowed with purpose.
"Ah, that is good, Monsieur Roland. It seems that the hand which guides the destiny of Nemi is still unerring."
And then more quietly,
"You know what power is yours to command?"
"Mademoiselle Korasoff has told me something, but with skillful advisors——"
"All will be well, monsieur. But you will have many advisors. They are coming here today. But you must select the wheat from the chaff. I shall tell you whom to trust. Russia must be born again. You shall help her in the pains of birth, save her from the malevolent hands which threaten to throttle her in the very act of being."
"It is a great destiny you plan, monsieur. The society of Nemi may be powerful, but I can hardly believe that such a powerful autocracy as Germany——"
"Monsieur, you have heard some of the rumblings in the Reichstag. Liebknecht the elder blazed the way. His son has followed."
"Oh yes, Liebknecht. I've heard."
"Only the military might of Germany holds the nation intact. But even in its might it trembles. Nemi is strong in Germany. In many regiments the socialists have revolted, and in the navy mutiny. Those men realize that there is a force let loose into the world before which the selfish aims of the rulers of the countries of the earth are as chaff in the wind. Not one nation shall rule, or several, but all, monsieur, all. Internationalism."
"Do you know what that means?" And as Roland remained silent, as though in deep thought, Codkina threw his long arms out in a wide gesture.
"You shall see. The time comes soon."
"And you will help me, monsieur?" Roland asked urbanely.
"With all my heart and intelligence."
Codkina smiled, and the two men clasped hands. Monsieur Codkina's hands were very white and as smooth as a woman's, but there was strength in the sinew beneath. Internationalism, a fine word which might mean anything. If this man were Roland's enemy, at least he should not start with any advantage. The new leader of Nemi was learning, still moving in the dark, for the names of those who had come into power in Russia, Lvov, Rodzianko, and the others, had seemed to stand for all that was best in the interests of free government. And so he had let Monsieur Codkina out, that he might inspect in profile, as it were, the motives which underlay his politics. As yet nothing definite, only a suspicion. As to the sincerity of his beliefs in the ritual of Nemi, Roland was soon enlightened.
"You are a practical man, Monsieur Roland,"
Codkina went on easily.
"You are no doubt mystified by the curious sequence of events which have brought you here to Nemi as titular head of this great and secret order. But I, too, am a practical man, and I will be frank with you. I care nothing for symbols. Whatever the society of Nemi is in the minds of its legion of followers, to me it is merely a means to a great end, the safety and peace of all Europe. The fulfillment of the promises of the legend is extraordinary, almost incredible, but neither you nor I, as men of the world, can believe that it comes from any supernatural agency. Kirilio Ivanitch was immolated upon the altar of his own fears, a sacrifice to his own superstition. He killed the priest who preceded him, for years his nemesis. A true nemesis, my friend, has pursued him. But you, monsieur, must permit no such doubts to poison your usefulness." "Why should I?" laughed Roland. "A man attacks me, stabs me with a knife. If he is killed, is it my fault? My conscience is clear." "Good. Then we understand each other." He broke off with a shrug. "As to the ritual of Nemi, there is a strength in mysticism, a fact which the vile Rasputin was not long in finding out. A little ceremonial does no harm, and you, monsieur, must play your part with skill and some caution." "By all means," said Roland with a laugh, "until the new priest of Nemi shall find me out. Then at least I assure you that I shall not stand on ceremony." "Ah, as to that you may reassure yourself," said Codkina easily. "A miracle such as this may sometime happen by chance, but not twice in one generation."
"At least," Roland concluded cheerfully, "you may be sure that I am not afraid."
"Perhaps it is well that we have a soldier at Nemi," said Codkina with a smile. And then after a pause, "Tell me, monsieur, did Mademoiselle Korasoff commit to your keeping any documents, any papers?"
"None," lied Roland coolly. "As you know, this affair has happened so recently."
"There were no papers found upon the body of Monsieur Ivanitch?"
"If they have not been removed by Isad or Stepan, they should be upon his body now."
"Ah, I will inquire."
And getting up quickly, Monsieur Codkina made his way out of the room in the direction of the adjoining apartment. Tanya, a warning finger to her lips, joined Roland immediately. It seemed that she must have been near the door, waiting for the chance to speak with him alone. "You were careful?" she asked. "As careful as a person may be who walks on a floor carpeted with eggshells," said Roland with a smile. "He asked if I had told you anything, given you anything?" Roland nodded. "He has gone to search the body," he said. "For the paper I gave you," whispered Tanya. "I found it in the pocketbook of Kirilio Ivanitch. I took it there in the garden as I knelt beside him. You have committed it to memory?" "Yes. Droite, 72. Gauche, 23. Droite, 7. "Sh! You can remember it?" "Yes." "Then destroy it quickly." Roland struck a match, lighted the scrap of paper, and threw it into the hearth. She went toward the door, stood in a tense moment of listening, and then quickly returned. "Do not trust him, monsieur, and be upon your guard against him always. For the present, nothing more. I shall contrive to meet you tonight." She walked to the chair which Monsieur Codkina had left, and motioned Roland to another, and then raising her voice, spoke easily in a conversational tone of the members of the council who were to join them later in the day. A few moments later, Monsieur Codkina, his brows troubled in thought, came into the room. "You found nothing?" asked Tanya.
"His watch, the talisman, some keys, a little money, nothing else."
"What was it you were looking for, monsieur?" inquired Roland. Codkina glanced at Tanya and shrugged.
"A memorandum. It does not matter. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Zoya. During the afternoon, other members of the Council of Nemi reached the village and arrived at the gate in the wall where Isad, clad in his dark robes and sensible of his own importance, greeted them with all solemnity, and conducted them to the house where Tanya Korasoff, Kodkina, and Roland received them. First, Shestov, who was blond, bald, and slightly pockmarked, with a long neck consisting mostly of tendons and Adam's apple. Shestov spoke French with a thickness of tongue which gave the impression of being constantly under the influence of liquor, a mere impediment of the speech, for as Roland afterward discovered, no spirits of any kind had ever passed his lips. Then came Liedermann and Mademoiselle Kolodna. Liedermann was heavy, Hebraic, and noisy. Irina Kolodna silent, abstracted, and intense. Monsieur Barthoud, mild-mannered, quiet, but eager, his sandy hair cropped short, his little red-rimmed eyes magnified many-fold behind his enormous goggles. And lastly, Madame Rochal. If internationalism was the keynote of Monsieur Kodkina's politics, the term might in a general way be applied to the curious and striking personality of Madame Rochal, for she reflected such an intense cosmopolitanism that it was at first difficult to identify her with any nation of Europe. Her name might have been French, Russian, or Spanish, and her gown might have come from Paris or Vienna. She spoke all languages, French, German, Russian, English, with equal facility, each, it seemed, with a slight accent or tinge of the others, but without preference or favor. Her eyes, set a little obliquely in her head, were of the night, dark and unfathomable, and her hair, black with a faint green violet gloss, was folded back at each side over her ears like the two wings of a raven. She was jeweled, exotic, slightly tinted, and exhaled a faint suggestion of daintily mingled perfumes. To all appearances she was less than 30 in years, though in her eyes lurked the wisdom of centuries. All of these persons were informed by Monsieur Kodkina, the earliest arrival, of the tragic event of the morning and of Philip Roland's share in it. Monsieur Kodkina pitched his drama in a low key, spoke with great seriousness, and earnestly requested the new arrivals to consider the evidence in the light of their own understanding, and showed them the body of Ivanich and the broken bough, in token of the fulfillment of the prophecy. As to his own mind, he said, that was already made up. As a member of the order, he would take commands from none other than Monsieur Roland, who was now the president of the Order of Nemi. Roland said nothing, and stood soberly, trying not to laugh, studying this queerly assorted company who had listened to the Russian, regarding the American with a new and rather morbid interest, appraising him, so Roland thought, as one examines an egg which one expects to devour. Whatever the others may have thought, only Liedermann was outspoken. He got up, swaying from one foot to the other like a great brown bear, his hairy fists clenched, his black brows beetling, as he roared his opinions in a French tinged abominably with gutturals.
"Pfui! A new priest, and an American! You have a doctrine over in your country. You should permit us to apply it here, in Europe, for Europeans, monsieur. We do not need to go so far."
"But the laws of the order," broke in Codkina.
Poof! Grisha Codkina. We are no longer children believing in the necromancy of the Middle Ages. I, for one, am no exorcist. We live in no day of incantations, nor can we accept the idols which a past age has set up for us. The train of coincidences is extraordinary, but let us accept it as such and end the matter. The Council of Nemi has borne with Kirillo Ivanich because, as we all know, he formed a proper buffer between our conflicting aims. But Kirillo Ivanich is dead. When our numbers are filled, let us elect a leader, a priest, if you still choose to call him such, who will conduct our meetings and do our bidding. As for this Monsieur Roland," and he gave a grunt, "as far as I am concerned, he may very well go upon his way."
"That is impossible," came the cold, clear voice of Madame Rochal, her strange eyes fixed on Roland's face. "The new leader of the Order of Nemi has already been selected in accordance with a destiny which it is not my privilege, nor yours, Herr Liedermann, to thwart." Herr Liedermann stopped rocking and stared at the speaker, a look of sudden perplexity at his brows.
"You, sire!" he roared.
"I," she returned with a quick flash of her eyes. "And why not? God knows we need new wits to bring us harmony. Why not Monsieur Roland's?"
"But,"
she shrugged and turned to Shestov, who was speaking. "Madame Rochal is not often wrong, and her influence is not to be despised. For Russia I can speak. A man who is willing to offer his own blood unselfishly in sacrifice for a nation not his own is a friend to freedom and to Russia." The red-rimmed eyes of Monsieur Barthoud blinked enormously behind his goggles. "I am for the old order of things, as they have been since the beginning."
"And shall be everlastingly," said Codkina sententiously. "Amen. And you, Irina Kolodna?" he asked.
"What has been shall be," she replied in her soft Italian accent. "Whatever happens, the order must not be broken."
"Bah!" thundered Liedermann.
"And jeopardize our leadership of the cause of the world by investing this adventurer, this soldier of fortune, with the right to—"
"Hush, Max!" cried Zoya Rochal shrilly. "You are a beast." Liedermann rocked in a moment of silence and then sank into a chair, his fists clasped over his folded arms. Roland regarded him a moment, and then, as the gaze of the others was turned toward him, took a pace forward, faced them, and after a glance at Codkina, spoke quietly and with growing assurance, while the smile that always lurked at the corners of his lips seemed to be struggling against his sober demeanor. "Messieurs et mesdames," he said politely, "I am, as this excellent and veracious Herr Liedermann has just said, both an adventurer and a soldier of fortune. But if he chooses to turn these words against me, I can only reply that I am an adventurer in the greatest cause the world has ever known, a soldier for the fortune of freedom which is to come. I am no diplomat, but a soldier of France, which stands resolute, undaunted, immovable upon its new frontier. I have been in the cauldron before Verdun, and thus am the only one among you who has seen hell upon this earth. I say to you, messieurs and mesdames, that death is nothing when compared to the tension of nerves tightened like bowstrings. After that, I say there is no war that can be right, no peace that can be wrong." There was a movement of approval, and Roland grinned comfortably, and then went on. "Your cause is mine, and whatever the means by which you accomplish peace, that is mine also. I will do your bidding if you desire it. But if, as Herr Liedermann suggests, the good of your society is best conserved by my departure, I am ready to go upon my way." "Enough, monsieur." Sawyer Rochal rose and threw out one white hand in a wide gesture. "We need you at Nemi, Monsieur Roland. Is it not so, you others?" She challenged them quietly, but her eyes shot fire at the silent Liedermann, who stared up at her from under heavy brows and shrugged.
"I am outvoted," he said. "I have no more to say."
"That is well," said Codkina. He crossed the room and clasped Roland by the hands, an example which all the others now followed. Tanya had stood at one side, a silent spectator of this scene, smiling slightly, aware of her own part in this decision, but watching keenly as they came forward. Madame Rochal was the last to greet the visitor. Their hands met, and Roland bowed over the jeweled fingers. "I thank you for your indulgence, madame," he said. "Do not let Herr Liedermann disturb you," she whispered. "We are of many minds at Nemi, but the danger lies not in what is said, monsieur, but in what is unsaid." "I understand. Perhaps you'll help me." "Perhaps. We shall see." And with a deep look into Roland's eyes, she passed on and joined the others, who, following Margot, the old woman whom Roland had seen in the kitchen, went up the stairs to be shown the rooms they were to occupy. For a moment Roland and Tanya were alone. "Do you think her beautiful?" the girl asked. "Magnetic, startling, but beautiful? The beauté du diable, perhaps. But mademoiselle," Tanya moved her expressive fingers, "she is the most dangerous woman in Europe." "You alarm me," he grinned. "The only powder a soldier fears is the poudre de riz." She smiled. "I'm not jesting." "Nor I. You warn me against her?" "If you love freedom. She is an agent of the Wilhelmstrasse." "Ah, I see. But her nationality?" "No one knows. What does it matter? She is an actress, a friend of princes in Russia, in Austria, a go-between, a shuttlecock playing her own game for her own ends." "And Liedermann? Is it not obvious? Her servitor. But why should she have chosen to accept me without question as the new president of the order?" Tanya was silent a moment, and then, "Because, if I may make so bold as to say so," she said, "your guileless appearance marks a line of least resistance, best suited to her methods of attack. Kirillo Ivanich was immune. She thinks to find you less difficult. In other words," she finished dryly, "she means to use you, monsieur." "I shall be guileless, mademoiselle, as long as I can learn something, but not too guileless to be ungrateful to you." She shrugged and laughed as he glanced toward the stairway whence came the sound of voices. Roland laughed quietly. "I'm pledged to you, to Codkina, and to Madame Rochal. Messieurs Shestoff and Bartou are perhaps on my side. Before the hour passes I shall swear allegiance to Signorina Kolodna and Herr Liedermann." He grinned. "The society of Nemi, at least, shall be cohesive, and I shall be the amalgam." "This is no joke." "Nevertheless, I shall not cry over it." He caught her hand and pressed it in his strong fingers. "Will you let me solve these problems in my own way? If I seem to be guileless, humor me for my simplicity, but do not distrust me, mademoiselle. For of all these who are at Nemi, it is you only who shall be my guide." "You swear it?" she whispered. "Upon my honor." Her face flamed suddenly and her glance fell. Then he kissed her hand and released her just as Codkina entered from the garden, where what had once been Kirillo Ivanich had without ceremony been put below the ground. But the lines at Monsieur Kodkina's brows were not born of this gruesome informality, for it seemed that Nemi turned without question from old gods to new, but of another matter, which for some hours had obviously given him inquietude.
"If Monsieur Roland will permit," he said, gravely turning to Tanya, "Mademoiselle Korasoff is best informed to speak of the affairs of Kirilio Ivanitch and of the business pending in the council." "Shall I leave you, monsieur?" asked Roland. "Why? You are one of us, our leader." Roland chose to read something satirical in his ceremonious bow. "Well," said the American good humoredly, "what's the order of business?" "The reports from the various central committees which these councilors represent, appropriations of money to carry on the propaganda and the plans for Russia. But first it is necessary to see into the condition of the affairs of Monsieur Ivanitch. The vault must be opened." "The vault?" echoed Roland. Kodkina nodded and glanced at Tanya. "The priest of Nemi is sole custodian of the documents and funds of the order. Only Ivanitch knew the secret of the doors to the vault." Here he turned suddenly to the girl. "Unless, perhaps, you, Tatanya?" "What should I know, Grisha Kodkina?" she said coolly. "I have merely observed orders. Kirilio Ivanitch entrusted me with no such weighty responsibility as this." "And yet it is strange that no record should be left."
"Kirilio Ivanitch died without speaking."
"But you, Tatiana, were closest in his confidence. He must have given some sign, left some paper."
"Search for it then. His room, his desk, his clothing."
"I have done so. There is nothing."
Roland found another cigarette, which he lighted with the greatest cheerfulness. "An impasse," he smiled. "What are you going to do about it?" Kodkina shrugged.
"That is a grave question, Monsieur Roland."
"Dynamite," suggested the American.
Kodkina paced the floor slowly for a moment, and then to the girl: "Go, Tatiana, if you please, and make a thorough search. Perhaps you may succeed where I have failed."
Tanya turned toward the door and then paused. "And the others? What shall you say to them?" she asked.
"Tell them the truth," said Kodkina.
The Russian waited until Tanya had gone, and then coming close to the new president of Nemi, spoke rapidly and in whispers.
"You and I are allied for a common purpose. The vault is outside in the garden, deep under the tree. We must find a way into it, you comprehend, without the knowledge of these others."
"Yes, but how?"
"That we shall devise. I will find a way."
At the sound of voices he glanced toward the door.
"Meanwhile," he whispered, "say nothing."
Roland nodded, and they drew apart as Madame Rochal and Shestov entered the room. "Ah, Machiavelli," she said, coming forward with a smile. "Already wrapping your tendrils around the tree of Nemi." Kodkina laughed uneasily.
"My tendrils, perhaps, do not grow so far or cling so tightly as yours may do, Madame."
Zoya Rochal glanced at Roland, who caught her look. "For the wild rose, Madame," said the new priest quietly. "The oak always bears a lifelong friendship." "Ah, monsieur, who has taught you to make pretty speeches? But be sure that I am no poison vine," she said with a shrug. "It is only the dead oak tree that the poison vine loves. I, Madame, am very much alive." She flashed a quick smile at him, at once a challenge and a reproach, while Kodkina looked on gravely. "Only an escaping slave shall break the golden bough," muttered the literal Shestov soberly. Zoya Rochal laughed. "You, Grisha Kodkina?" she said significantly. Kodkina started.
"Or you, Madame,"
he replied quickly. "A slave," she said. "I have escaped from one servitude into another, but to have political opinions in Russia is fortunately no longer a crime." Roland looked from one to the other and laughed. "Monsieur Shestov has rendered me a service," he said with a grin. "I didn't know of this menace. If you, Madame Rochal, desire my life, you shall take it at once." He picked up the dagger of Kirillo Ivanich, which had been brought into the house and put upon the table, and thrust the handle toward her. But she shuddered prettily and turned away. "As for you, Monsieur Kotkinna," he said coolly, "from this moment I must be upon my guard." But the Russian saw no humor in this pleasantry.
"Enough of this nonsense, monsieur. Let us go in to dinner."
And yet this controversy, which had been heard by the others who had followed Zoya Rochal into the room, in spite of its apparent triviality, had done something to clear the atmosphere. Roland's perfect good humor and air of guilelessness, which seemed to see nothing but good humor and guilelessness in all those about him, had the effect of providing a common meeting ground of good fellowship for those of different camps, and whatever the diversity of their opinions, the darkness of their thoughts and purposes, the dinner table gave no sign of the deeper undercurrents of their various allegiances. And when they all rose from the table at the conclusion of the meal, Roland and Madame Rochal went to smoke their cigarettes. "I can't make you out, Monsieur Roland," she said when they were seated on a bench at the end of the garden. "At times you seem very much like an overgrown boy," she began, "and then something makes me think that you are not so ingenuous as you look." "I have traveled the world over, Madame," said Roland with a laugh, "but I've never managed to learn anything except that women are very beautiful and that men are born to be slaves." She laid her fingers along his coat sleeve. "Don't you know, foolish boy," she muttered with sudden earnestness, "that you have happened upon the very edge of an inferno?" "No, you surprise me. It has seemed very much like a sort of pleasant game to me." He laughed. "I kill, quite by accident, the chap that runs your shebang, and you all come along and pat me on the back. It's great, I tell you. You haven't been in a German prison pen, madame. The conversation is hardly worth mentioning. The food is unmentionable. And now, for the first time in a year, I find myself set down in a milieu of beautiful women and clever men with real food to eat and real conversation to listen to. And you, madame, wish to spoil my evening by speaking of infernos. It's really not considerate of you." He lolled lower in his seat and smoked luxuriously, gazing at her through half-closed eyes. The fingers on his arm tightened. "I tell you, monsieur, that you are in great danger. Here, at this moment. Don't you understand?"
"I understand what you say," he said, smiling at her lazily.
"It's the truth," she repeated. "Danger of death, sudden, at any time." "I am so contented, madame. I can imagine no moment more agreeable in which to die." "You anger me. Have you no eyes to see what is going on about you?" Roland straightened and glanced carelessly over his shoulder. "And what is going on about me?" he asked. "You have become, in a moment, the most important single figure in Europe. You do not believe me. It is true. Around you, here at Nemi, seethes a struggle of nations gasping for breath, and you sit and look into my eyes and dream."
"You must blame that upon your eyes," he whispered.
She shrugged, moved impatiently, and then, after looking cautiously around them into the shrubbery, turned toward him again. "I pray you to listen to me, monsieur," she said eagerly. "I like you, Philippe Roland. From the first, in there, when I saw you, I knew that I should like you. I don't know why." She shrugged expressively. "You are different, but you are also very foolish, and I would not like to see you come to harm." "And who would harm me?" he said coolly. "Perhaps I am foolish, but you must blame that upon my sense of humor. I blunder into the midst of a pretty little opera bouffe, worthy of the best traditions of Offenbach, with chaps in cowls and cassocks, pottering about a saddish-looking tree and muttering about escaping slaves. And you ask me to be afraid. Perhaps when I get through being amused there will be time for that. For the present, madame, will you bear with me and tell me something about yourself?" She threw out an arm with a dramatic gesture which showed something of her training. "Ah, I have no patience with you, Philippe Roland," she said. "You are impossible. Think of what I shall tell you, for it is very important. Under the mound below the tree is the treasure vault of Nemi. It is built of steel, like a bank, and no one may enter it without the secret numbers which open the lock. Those numbers were known only by Kirillo Ivanich, and he is dead." "That's unfortunate," said Roland as she paused. "But you can't blame me." "Do you know what is in that vault, Philippe Roland?" she asked. "I can't imagine. A pig with a ring in the end of his nose?" He smiled. "You still disbelieve? Well, I will tell you. The funds of the order at this time can amount to little less than 25 millions of francs. They are there for you or for anyone with imagination to divert into the proper channels." Roland's eyes, in spite of himself, had become a little larger. "I'm no burglar, madame. I've done almost everything, but safe cracking is a little out of my line." "And yet it is upon you that the responsibility for this money devolves. If it is stolen, you will be held accountable." "Stolen? Who will steal it?" She shrugged. "Who wouldn't, in a righteous cause?" She caught his arm again to emphasize the importance of her words. "To help the cause of free institutions in Europe? You, I, anyone with a cause like that near his heart." Roland flicked his cigarette into the bushes. "I am very dense. There seem to be more causes than one at Nemi, more axes than one to grind. Let me be direct," he said coolly. "Yours, Madame Rochal?" "What is it?" he asked. She glanced at him swiftly. "You do not know?" "Obviously, or I should not be asking." She paused a moment, looking away from him, and then, as though coming to a resolution, she turned and spoke in a low tone. "These others believe that I am acting for the Social Democrats of Germany, like Max Liedermann. But that is not the case." "Ah, what then?" "I am trusting you, monsieur." "By the witchery in your eyes, I swear." She paused a moment, as though to be sure of her effect, and then in a whisper, "I am a secret agent of the Provisional Government of Russia." Roland sat silent a second and then laid his hand over hers, while his lips broke into a boyish smile. "I knew it, madame. I was sure of it," he whispered softly. "Our cause is the same. You and I together. What can we not do for Russia and for freedom?" He was so ingenuous, so boyish, so handsome. His very youth refreshed her. She sighed and then laughed softly as she raised the back of her hand toward his lips. "There," she murmured, "you may kiss my hand." But Roland only glanced at the hand, and before Madame Rochal knew what he was about, had caught her in his arms and kissed her full upon the lips. "Monsieur!" she stammered and drew away from him hurriedly. Roland followed her glance and turned to find Tanya Korasov standing before them. Roland sprang to his feet and stood, his head bowed, looking indeed rather crestfallen. "Mademoiselle," he began, but she cut him short with a gesture, speaking rapidly, and he saw that she was very pale and suffering under some suppressed agitation. "Monsieur, you are to come to the house at once in the name of freedom. Grisha Kotkina demands it." "I will go at once." Tanya had already turned and fled down the path. Roland had taken only a few paces when Zoya Rochal rushed alongside of him and seized his arm. Be watchful, Philippe Roland," she whispered tensely, "for it is he whom you have most to fear." He laughed softly as he caught her fingers to his lips. "Thanks, madame," he said gaily. "No one shall kill me at Nemi but you. That I promise." And left her standing in the darkness. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Camouflage. Roland's long strides overtook Tanya before she reached the lighted spaces of the lawn. He had called to her, but she had not stopped, and so as he caught up with her he barred her way down the path. "Mademoiselle Korasoff," he blurted out eagerly. "Just a word." She stopped and faced him, still pale in the moonlight, but quite composed, waiting for him to go on. I've been placed in a false light. I would like—" "How, monsieur?" she said indifferently. "What you saw just now there. Perhaps you think—" His words stumbled and at last failed completely, for he saw that she was bent on making explanations difficult. "What does it matter to me," she said, "whom you embrace and why?" He felt the sting under her words, and realized that every phrase he uttered only placed him at a greater disadvantage. "I can make no explanation," he muttered. "If you think me a fool, I'm sorry. And yet I'll prove that your confidence was not misplaced." Another silence, during which Tanya walked onward without sign that she heard him. "Madame Rochal has just confided that she is an agent of the provisional government in Russia." "And you believed her?" "No, but she believes that I believe her." "Are you sure?" She shrugged. "You are no match for a woman of her antecedents." "I shall meet her with her own weapons." "It seems," she said disdainfully, "that you have already begun well." "Mademoiselle Korasoff, enough of this," he said firmly, and after a swift search of a bush nearby again placed himself in the path in front of her so that she couldn't pass him. "You may think me a philanderer if you like, or a fool if that pleases you better, but the end is worthy of the means. Already I've found out some of the things I wanted to know. The vault beneath the tree will be robbed unless you and I can prevent." Her eyes flashed with sudden attention. He had arrested her interest at last. "Ah, you know." He grinned. "I'm in league with both burglars. I've only consulted two. There may be others." "Zoya Rochal?" "And Kodkina. I suspect Liedermann also." Tanya stood silent a moment, and then a wan smile rewarded him. "You see, I was right." And then bravely, "This must be prevented, monsieur." "Yes, but how?" "Merely by robbing the vault yourself." "But I shall need your help, mademoiselle. This money must be removed for safe keeping until it can be properly used." "Yes, I can help in that." "We must waste no time. The sooner the better. Where is the entrance to the vault?" "An iron door near the wall beyond the mound. I have a key." "Meet me here, then, in the shadow of these trees, tonight, at 1 o'clock. Do you agree?" "Yes," she said after a moment. "I must." "And do you forgive me for——" She raised her head and looked past him toward the lighted windows. "What does it matter, monsieur?" she said coldly. "Whether I forgive or not? Come." And moving quickly, she led the way toward the house while Roland followed, still certain that however clever he thought himself, he felt a good deal of a fool. Kodkina, pacing the floor of his room upstairs, awaited Roland's coming impatiently, but with an effort composed his features in a smile as the American appeared.
"Ah, monsieur," he said, "it is too bad that I should feel it necessary to interrupt your tête-à-tête with Madame Rochal, who, as we all know, is the most charming woman in the world. But the president of Nemi is not a free agent. There are matters requiring your attention in conference with me." "Of course. Then may I go, monsieur?" asked Tanya from the doorway.
"Yes, go,"
said Codkina, with an abstracted wave of his hand and a peremptory tone which made a frown gather at Roland's brow. Gone were Monsieur Codkina's soft accents of greeting and his courtly bow, and Tanya seemed in awe of him, her look hanging upon his commands. Roland remembered the agitation in her manner when she had come to summon him to this conference. Had Codkina frightened her tonight? And how? Why? Was there something between them, some threat of Russian for Russian, born of politics or intrigue, in which Codkina played the master hand? Or was it something nearer, more personal? It seemed curious to Roland that he should be thinking of this for the first time. He had formed his first impression of Tanya there last night in the garden, when clad in her cowl and robes she had seemed so abstracted from the world outside. A very inferior mother superior, as she had called herself, and by this token secluded but very human. He had considered the fact of her extraordinary beauty merely as a fortunate accident, and having dismissed her relations with Ivanich from his mind, had dismissed all other sentimental possibilities, all, that is, except his own. A love affair, of course. With Codkina? Perhaps. And yet that would hardly explain the Russian's attitude toward her tonight, or hers toward him. The one thing that seemed to rise uppermost in Roland's mind was Tanya's fear of Codkina. As he joined the Russian at the table by the lamp, he found himself examining Monsieur Codkina with a new interest and a new antipathy. "I have here some documents requiring your attention, in order that you may familiarize yourself with the order of business tomorrow, when our circle is complete. The report of Herr Liedermann from the Socialists of Germany, that of Mademoiselle Kolodna from Rome, appeals from Shestov and Bartou. You will read them tonight, monsieur?" "Willingly. But this, Monsieur Codkina, was not why you interrupted my tête-à-tête in the garden," said Roland slowly. "You had another motive." Codkina smiled, got up and shut the door, and went on in a low tone. "Why should I not be honest with you? Madame Rochal is not to be trusted, monsieur. She has already surprised me. She opposed Liedermann in accepting you unreservedly as our leader. It was from these two that I had expected resistance. Liedermann is a member of the Reichstag. Madame Rochal?" He shrugged. "If you can tell what she is, you are cleverer than the rest of us. She brings credentials from a central committee in Bavaria, but that means nothing. Such things are arranged. I merely wished to warn you before you had committed yourself to her interests." "You need have no fear. I've grown my pin feathers. The cause in which we are interested is more important to me than the fascinations of Madame Rochal." "We understand each other, monsieur. We are friends. You will help me. I will help you. We shall work together in a harmony that will bring great good to the world. Are you satisfied?" "Quite." Codkina offered his hand, and Roland took it, longing at that moment, in a boyish sense of bravado, to try grips with the Russian and see which was the better of the two. But his common sense told him that if there were to be a trial of strength between them, it would be a test of mind.
of Roland's cleverness against the Russian's finesse, of the American's skill in dissimulation against Kodkin's skill in intrigue. As yet there was no damage done, and with Tanya's help, Roland perhaps held the stronger hand.
To show you the confidence I place in you, Monsieur Roland, I shall give you this."
And Kodkina, with a deliberateness intended to convey the importance of the matter, took out of his card case a small flat silver disc, which he fingered a moment and then handed to Roland. The American examined it curiously. It bore in low relief the double head just upon the pedestal in the room downstairs, and below it the words Rex Nemorensis. "A proof of your confidence, monsieur." "What?"
"The talisman of our society, taken from the watch chain of the dead priest, worn only by the priest, but known throughout Europe. Shown to members of our committees, it will carry you safely anywhere."
"Ah, thanks, monsieur."
"You will forgive me for sending for you, will you not? But it will not do for you to move in the dark. Trust no one but me."
He took up the papers on the table and handed them to the American.
"Now go to your room and study these papers carefully, with my notes upon the margins. For it is according to this that the council must act tomorrow. But see no one else tonight. Tomorrow morning I will come to your room and tell you of my plan to enter the vault."
"I shall do as you suggest, monsieur. I am very tired. When I read these papers I shall be ready for a good night of sleep."
"That is well. Good night, monsieur."
"Good night." In the seclusion of his room the leader of Nemi had much to think of. The labyrinth had grown deeper. Its mazes were more tortuous, but like Theseus he still held to the silken cord which bound him to Tanya Korasoff, and having trusted to his own instincts he was now ready to follow blindly where she led him. But it was clear that Tanya had not underrated the skill and strength of Monsieur Kodkina. He was indeed an adversary worthy of any man's mettle. Under his polished veneer, Monsieur Kodkina was made of hardy wood of a fine grain, but none the less strong because of that. Though there had been no chance to verify his impressions by a conversation with Tanya, Roland had decided that Kodkina was working in the interests of Germany for a separate peace with Russia, which would throw all the strength of the German armies upon France, England, Italy, and the United States. A mere surmise, and based upon the instinct that Tanya was true and a friend of Russia, for which Roland had fought and was fighting. Without Tanya, the whole structure of his intrigue fell to the ground. If he believed that Madame Rochal was an agent of the provisional government of Russia, he must also believe that Tanya was plotting against it. And if Madame Rochal were an agent of the Wilhelmstrasse, working in the same interests as Monsieur Kodkina, why should the Russian distrust her? And what was the threat which Kodkina held over Tanya? There seemed no end to the tangle and no course of action but to move softly and await developments. The story of the amount of treasure in the vault below the tree had opened his eyes. Here perhaps was the answer to some of the questions that perplexed him. Politics of the sort that had been disclosed here would stop at nothing. The times in which he lived made murder a matter of small importance. And what was his own career in France but that of murder, highly specialized? Roland was sure that his own safety now hung upon his continued display of friendship and collaboration in Monsieur Kodkina's plans. And those plans, in brief, seemed to be nothing less than the looting of the strong box of Nemi before Madame Rochal or Max Liedermann could get at it. And for what cause? For Germany, or merely for Grisha Kodkina? Roland had no weapons, not even a pocket knife, and Kodkina carried an automatic in his hip pocket, for Roland had contrived to brush his arm against it earlier in the evening. The situation was interesting, but hardly to his liking. He longed for a good American Colt revolver, one shot of which, well placed, was worth all the automatics in the world. But the business before him tonight admitted of no delay, nor of any consideration for his own safety. At 1 o'clock he was to meet Tanya at the lower end of the garden, and with luck, by morning the money and the papers in the vault would be well out of harm's way if Tanya could find a place for their safe keeping. Then, so far as Roland was concerned, they might dynamite the vault to their heart's content. Droite 72, gauche 23, droite 7. He had repeated the figures to himself frequently, and now continued to do so, taking a new delight in their significance. 25 millions of francs, $5 million. They might go far if properly used, in the interests of the cause he served. Whose money was this? How long had it accumulated, and what the purpose of those who had contributed? Peace? Surely peace would come most quickly if Germany were defeated. And was not he the president of Nemi, the chosen of the council to represent all the members of the society? Whether socialists, revolutionists, maximalists, minimalists, or what not, the way was difficult, so difficult that there was no arbitrament but the sword. The counter-revolutionists of Russia should not betray France, and those who led Russia to destruction under the protection of a fine catchword should not succeed in their treachery if it was in his power to prevent. Reasoning in this way, Phil Roland lighted another of the cigarettes of the dead Ivanich, while he scanned the documents entrusted to him by Grisha Kodkina, and awaited the hour when he should join Tanya Korasov below in the garden. He had no watch, but a clock in the hall downstairs announced the hours slowly. At 11 he blew out his candle and sat in a chair by the window, waiting and listening. It was necessary that Monsieur Kodkina should be disarmed. He heard footsteps in the hall outside from time to time, and snored discreetly. He had taken the precaution to fasten the bolt of his door, and so feared nothing from the hall. Outside in the garden all was quiet. The moon had set, the moon that had shed its inconstant beams upon his own dissimulation and Zoya Rochal's. Alluring female, that, the essence of all things enchanting. The woman of 30, a woman with a past, a component of faint, delightful odors. Women like that had a way of going to a fellow's head. What the deuce had happened to her after Roland's sudden exit from the stage she had set for him? He smiled as he remembered the results of his rather violent caress. If Tanya hadn't... Roland frowned into the darkness outside. Tanya! He would have given much if Tanya Korasov hadn't come along just at that moment. Women were strange creatures. He had fallen immeasurably in Tanya's eyes, the only ones at Nemi that mattered. He hadn't really wanted to kiss Zoya Rochal. It was merely that her lips were there to take, and he had taken them. He seemed quite sure that Madame Rochal had not been displeased, and tomorrow he must still play the game. The clock in the hallway struck the half hour. 12:30. Roland bent over and took off his shoes, and then moved stealthily to the window, where he stood behind the curtain, peering out into the obscurity of the garden. There was no lantern upon the mound, and no dark figure watching by the tree, as there had been last night. Sure that no one was watching outside, he stuck his head and shoulders out of the window and looked around. All the lights were out. He had at first thought of descending from the window, which was less hazardous than passing down the corridor and stairs, but remembered that last night, after Tanya's warning, he had assured himself that there was no means of entrance to his room by the window. The wall below was quite bare of vines or projections, and at least 30 feet high. There was nothing for it but to go by the corridor. And so, with infinite pains to make no sound, he slowly moved the bolt of the door until it was drawn entirely back, and then waited, listening. Silence. He turned the knob cautiously and opened the door. So far so well. After another moment of listening, he took up his shoes and on tiptoe went noiselessly down the hallway. The house was as silent as the tomb. If the other members of the council had any suspicion of one another or of him, they gave no sign of it. The house indeed was too quiet. A snore from the door of Monsieur Codquina would have comforted him. At the top of the stairway he paused. There was one step that creaked, the 10th from the bottom. He had counted it as he came up tonight. The 10th from the bottom, and there were 33 in all. The 23rd, then. He went down carefully until he had counted 22, and then, with a hand on the balustrade, stepped over what he thought would be the offending stair upon the 24th, when a loud crash seemed to resound from one end of the echoing house to the other. Idiot! 24, of course! He had not counted the top step. To his own ears, used to the silence of the house, the noise seemed loud enough to have awakened the dead Ivanich, and he stood listening for a long minute, awaiting the shuffling of feet or the sounds of opening doors above, but nothing happened. The councilors of Nemi still slept. Roland grinned. "Fool's luck," he muttered to himself, and carefully opened the door into the garden, went out, stealing along the shrubbery past the kitchen, and in a moment had reached the security of the trees. There he stopped to put on his shoes and repeat to himself the numbers of the combination: 72, 23, 7. Gauche, droite, gauche. Or was it droite, gauche, droite? The numbers were right, but the direction? This was no time to be uncertain in such a matter. That Boche bombing party must have done something queer to his head. No, it was droite, gauche, droite. He was sure. Tanya would confirm that, perhaps. He found her in the shadow of the designated trees, where she had preceded him by some moments. She wore her cowl and robe, from beneath the folds of which she brought forth a revolver, which she handed to him. "You have read my mind, mademoiselle," he whispered joyfully. "It was this that I wanted the most." "You heard nothing?" "No, but one of the steps creaked abominably. And you, have you been here long?" "No, I came down the back stairs." And then, turning into the shrubbery beside them with no more ado, "Follow me, monsieur," she said. Her manner was eloquent of the business they had at hand, and reminiscent of nothing personal in their relations. Her thoughtfulness in arming him was merely a matter of self-protection. Her trust in him was a matter of necessity, for had she not already given him the numbers of the combination? He followed her quietly. They stole along the outside wall in single file, making a complete detour of the garden until they reached a clump of shrubbery near a spot where Roland had come over the wall. There they followed a well-worn path into the bushes and were confronted by a mound of earth, in the face of which was an iron door. Here Tanya paused, brought forth a key, and in a moment led the way down a flight of steps underground. It was pitch black below, but Tanya, who seemed to have thought of everything, brought out from the folds of her gown an electric pocket lamp, which she turned into the passageway before them, at the end of which Roland made out a steel door with a shining nickel knob and a handle. "The vault, Monsieur Roland," she said coolly. "It is of American manufacture. Doubtless you are familiar." She was looking at him as she spoke, and her eyes for the moment drove all thought of numbers from his head. He caught at her hand. "Mademoiselle, before we go on, tell me that you've forgiven me. I was but serving your cause." She shrugged away from him and flashed the light upon the shining metal knob of the vault door. "Serve it here, then," she said quickly. "There, the numbers. Droite, gauche." She was quite relentless. He chose to think her repudiation of him the measure of her purity, and with a last look at her fine profile, bent forward and fingered the metal knob. "Gauche 72," he muttered and paused. "Droite, monsieur," she said sharply. "Do you mean to say that you have forgotten?" "If you would be kind to me, mademoiselle," he pleaded, smiling, "perhaps I could remember better." "Oh," she gasped, "this is no time to lose one's wits." "You've robbed me of all I ever had." "Monsieur Roland," she whispered in anguish, "the numbers." "Say that you forgive me, mademoiselle," he pleaded again, turning toward her. She threw out her arms and the light of the torch went out. "Mademoiselle," he was whispering, "forgive." The light of the torch flared suddenly, full on his face. She had moved a pace away from him and the cowl had fallen from her head, but her eyes were studying his face intently. "Forgive," he repeated, smiling eagerly. Something in his expression may have satisfied her, for she thrust out her hand to meet his own. "Yes, yes," she muttered hurriedly, "I forgive," and suddenly switched the light upon the door of the vault. "And now the numbers." "Ah," he laughed, "I remember them instantly. Droite 72, gauche 23, droite 7, droite. Is it not extraordinary? I cannot do without you, Mademoiselle Tanya, nor you without me. I shall prove it to you. You shall see." As she did not reply, he relapsed into silence, bending in sudden concentration upon his task. And in a moment the click of a falling tumbler within the lock announced success. The knob moved no more. Then he took hold of the heavy handle and turned toward the girl with a laugh. "Open sesame," he said. "The Princess Tatiana wishes to enter." The light wavered as the girl drew back, and Roland saw amazement in her eyes. "Princess," she was whispering, "who told you of my title?" He stared at her blankly, and then her meaning came to him. "Why, no one, mademoiselle. The Princess Tatiana is a fairy friend of my childhood. I dreamed of her as now I dream of you." She stood puzzled a moment and then switched the light upon the door. "Open, Monsieur Roland," she said in a half whisper. He grasped the massive handle in both hands and with an effort swung the heavy mass of steel outward, and the dark entrance to the vault lay open to them. With no further words, Tanya flashed the light into the interior and quickly entered, while Roland followed. The place had a musty smell, but seemed quite dry, a fact afterwards explained by a double wall and a deep drainage system. The air was close, but the electric torch burned brightly, revealing rows of shelves, each carefully lettered, upon which were ancient parchments, discolored and illegible, documents bearing pendant seals, in metal boxes tied with heavy silken cords. There was a grinning skull, a steel cask of the Middle Ages, a spearhead, and an ancient piece of sculpture draped with jewels. Upon the floor at the further end, bulging leather sacks, and a rack of modern rifles and ammunition. All these Roland's glance took in at a first look, but his attention was quickly arrested by the actions of Tanya Korasoff, who bade him hold the light while she went to a shelf upon the right, where her nimble fingers quickly began running over a pile of documents in modern envelopes tied with tape. She read the superscriptions eagerly, and at last came to the one she sought. As she did so and took the envelope into her hands, a slight gasp of triumph escaped her. Roland, looking over her shoulder, read eagerly the fine script: Dossier de Gregory Kodkiner. And while Roland's eyes sparkled with this discovery, Tanya without ceremony broke the seal and took out the contents, scanning the papers rapidly, smiling and exclaiming by turns. "His history here," she whispered over her shoulder to Roland, indicating the first sheet. "And the evidence there," pointing to the documents. "It is what I have longed for months. Evidence, proof. Look," she said excitedly. "Read. Gregory Hochwald. A commission in the Prussian Guards, 1905. Signed Wilhelm, 1908. Appointment to the staff, 1910. Resignation. Liberal tendencies. Authorized at Potsdam, Russia, 1911. Instructions from Graf von Stromberg, 1912. Head of the Secret Service, monsieur. Member of the Duma. Other letters of instructions, 1913, 1914, 1916. Since the war, Monsieur Roland. Is it not damnable?" "Magnificent," gasped Roland over her shoulder. "We've got him, mademoiselle." And with a grin he paraphrased triumphantly, "Where Molly wore her beads." She glanced at him in a moment of incomprehension, then thrust the papers into their envelope and slipped them into the belt beneath her gown. "You see, monsieur," she whispered, "Kirillo Ivanich was well prepared to deal with this situation. He feared Grisha Kodkina always, but seemed to do as he wished. Now I know why. He was awaiting the overt act which should throw the man into his hands." "My heritage," whispered Roland. "And mine," said Tanya. "You feared him, mademoiselle. He holds some threat over you. Tonight, I saw." "I fear him no longer, Monsieur Roland." She smiled confidently. "Mademoiselle," said Roland with boyish eagerness, "if you'll only tell me, let me help you. I will——" "No more violence, monsieur. I shall deal with Grisha Kodkina in my own way." She took the torch from his hand without a word and led him to a corner of the vault, where upon the lower shelf were a number of packages carefully wrapped in black oilcloth. "Banknotes," she said. "Each note of 1,000 francs or its equivalent. There are 25,000 of them." "What shall we do with them? You have a plan?" The girl nodded. "It is arranged. We have no time to lose. Picard and Stepan are outside the wall. You will drop them over. I will show you." And taking up several packages of oilcloth, she bade Roland hold out his hands while she filled his arms. "Careful. Each one contains a fortune. Follow me." She turned toward the door into the passageway, then gasped suddenly and stopped, dropping her torch, which clattered upon the steel floor. But in the second before the light was extinguished, Roland saw that a figure stood at the entrance to the vault, a branch of foliage in one hand, while in the other pointed directly toward him, was a most significant weapon. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Disaster. The surprise was so complete that Roland stood for a moment immovable, staring at the spot in the darkness where Monsieur Codquina had been. But before he had time to spring aside, there was an explosion and the shock of a sudden impact against him as one of the packages flew from his arms. Close shooting, but he was unhurt, and, thinking quickly, dropped his bundles, dodged, and drew his revolver, waiting for the next flash of Monsieur Codquina's weapon. No sign or sound. Then an anguished gasp from Tanya. "Grisha Codquina!" she cried. "Don't shoot again! You killed him!"
"Stand aside!"
It was all the mark that Roland could hope for, and he fired low. At the sound, a pause of a second, and then the bullets from Monsieur Codquina's automatic crashed all around him. A splinter of wood struck him in the cheek, but if Roland was hit in the body he did not know it, and fired rapidly at the flashes until the hammer of his revolver clicked. His weapon was empty, as was Codquina's. Then, creeping along the shelves, groping with tense fingers, Roland made for the spot where the Russian had been. He felt a breath of air from outside through the powder fumes and knew that he had reached the door. His fingers grasped the cold steel of the door jamb, groped across the entrance, and touched an arm. A cry of terror from Tanya as he caught at her fiercely. "You, mademoiselle, thank God!" he muttered, and released her. "He is gone?" she stammered. The answer came suddenly from behind them, within the vault, as Codquina, rushing blindly in the darkness at the sound, brought up against Roland, who twisted around in his grasp, freeing his right hand, which struck blindly, harmlessly, and then at last found Codquina's throat. "Go, mademoiselle," gasped Roland. It is better. I will." Something told him that Codquina had another weapon, and as he felt the man free his right arm, he caught at it desperately, pinioning it to his side. His wrist. A knife. Everything depended upon the knife. He released the throat, and while blows rained upon his head and shoulders, twisted Codquina's wrist with both hands until he heard the knife go clattering upon the floor. "Even terms, monsieur," he gasped, as body to body they swayed from side to side in the darkness.
"You fool!"
stammered the other.
"To risk fortune on this madness."
"My risk," grinned Roland through his blood and sweat. Roland, thinking of Tanya and of Germany, fought with cool desperation, his arms around Codquina, crushing the very breath from his body. The man was weakening. Powerful as he was, his muscles had not been trained as the Americans had been in 3 years of life in the open.
"A truce, monsieur,"
Codquina whispered hoarsely, but Roland did not hear him and bore him back against the shelves to the left, where their feet stumbled over the pile of packages that Roland had dropped, and they fell, Roland uppermost, upon the floor. All the fight was out of Monsieur Codquina by this time, and he lay prone while Roland, the fog of battle still upon him, clutched with his bony fingers even after the man had stopped resisting. It was only when the American realized how tired his fingers were that he sat upon Codquina's stomach, somewhat bewildered as to what had happened, aware after a moment that his shoulder ached him badly and that his chest burned from his labored breathing, but otherwise that he was quite sound and cheerful. "Do you give up, you blighter?" he gasped in English, at last relapsing into the argot of his platoon of the Legion. You've got enough?" A groan from the man beneath was the only reply. "Well, what are you going to do about it?" he asked in a moment in French. "Nothing," stammered Kodkina, struggling for his breath. "I am vanquished." The situation was awkward. If Kodkina were strong enough, he might still slip away in the darkness. Roland was groping about on the floor beside him for a weapon of some sort, when he heard a frightened whisper behind him. "Monsieur Roland, are you safe?" Tanya was murmuring. "Yes, thanks. But I'm afraid to get up. Can you find the light here, somewhere on the floor?" "I'll try, monsieur," she whispered, and he heard her groping about on her hands and knees among the scattered packages. In a moment she found the torch and threw its blinding glare into the eyes of the antagonists. She stared at the sight of them, for the splinter wound in Roland's cheek still bled freely and made dark discolorations upon his clothing and linen. But the American was sitting upon Monsieur Kodkina's stomach, blinking cheerfully at the light. "You're hurt, monsieur?" she gasped. "Am I? It can't be serious. I'm feeling quite all right. And you, Monsieur Kodkina, comfortable?" The man groaned. "Enough, monsieur." Roland straightened and released his wrists. "There's about 1,000,000 francs between his shoulder blades. Come, roll over a bit, monsieur. The steel floor will be more comfortable." Kodkina obeyed as Roland relinquished the pressure, while Tanya stood dumb and motionless, as though the difficulties of their situation had driven her to her wits' ends.
Let me up, monsieur,"
groaned Kodkina. "Why? So that you can try to murder me again?"
"Hardly.
You've broken another golden bough."
"And you have vanquished me,"
muttered Kodkina.
"Kill me or let me go."
Roland chuckled. "Either alternative is pleasant to me, but one is dangerous."
"I am unarmed, also hurt," said Kodkina. "What harm can I do? You are stronger than I."
"No, merely more in earnest." As the flashlight wavered a moment in Tanya's hands, it fell for a second on the rack of rifles. "Ah, mademoiselle, I have it. If you'll give me the light," said Roland calmly, and wondering, she handed it to him. "Now, if you please, take a rifle there and load. The clips, I see, are upon the shelf." While Roland held the torch, Tanya obeyed quickly and handed the weapon to Roland, who, after examining it and testing it carefully, got quickly to his feet and ordered Kodkina to rise. "I'm no murderer, Monsieur Kodkina," he said easily. "Not in cold blood, at least. And you're quite safe if you remain perfectly still, while Mademoiselle Korasoff continues in the task you interrupted." Kodkina, who had gotten to his feet with an appearance of great difficulty, now stood quite subdued, still gasping for the breath which Roland had squeezed out of him.
"Monsieur,"
he muttered, his gaze shifting this way and that,
"let me speak."
"By all means," said Roland politely. "If you don't speak too long. We have other business."
"You blame me for protecting the treasury of Nemi. How should I have known that your intentions and Mademoiselle Korasoff's were innocent?"
"Merely by our guilelessness, Monsieur Kodkina," grinned Roland. Kodkina's smile was sickly.
"You are clever," he said. "I have done you an injustice. But why should we quarrel?"
"We won't. Our quarrel is ended. Is that all you want to say?"
"Let us be honest with each other. Our cause is the same."
"Is it? Then I'm the worst scoundrel unhung. No, Monsieur Kodkina, we shall go our ways, you yours, I mine. And now," with an inclination of the head, in excellent imitation, of Monsieur Kodkin's satirical amenities.
"If you will permit us, mademoiselle shall continue our interrupted task."
Tanya saw his look of command, and setting the catch on the torch and putting it upon the shelf and filling her arms with the bundles of banknotes, ran out through the door along the passage.
"What are you going to do with me?"
asked Kodkina, moving slightly toward the shelf behind him.
"Keep you safe until I can call a council together."
And then, as Kodkina moved another pace, "I would advise you to remain motionless. Another inch backward, monsieur, and I'll fire." Kodkina obeyed. The easy manner of the American had deceived him.
"What shall you tell them?"
he asked after a moment. "That you plan to rob the vault." Kodkina laughed.
"This comes ill of you, monsieur, who were already robbing it."
"No," said Roland good-naturedly. "We were merely removing the notes to a place of safety."
"Safety? And you think these others will believe you?"
"They will believe Mademoiselle Korasoff."
"Ah, is not my word as good as hers?"
Roland shrugged. "You're wasting your breath." Tanya returned at this moment, gathered up more banknotes, and saying nothing, went running down the corridor again. Kodkina moved his feet a little uneasily, but did not move, and his expression, which had been shifting through all the phases of uncertainty and apprehension, now broke into a smile.
"Monsieur Roland, I admire your skill and sang-froid. You have a better genius for the game of intrigue than many more experienced. We should be friends, you and I. There is much we might accomplish together."
Roland laughed and purposely lowered the muzzle of his rifle a few inches. "Ah, yes, perhaps," he shrugged. He was a little curious for a peep inside Monsieur Kodkina's brain. What might we accomplish? Kodkina's pale eyes examined Roland narrowly, and after a pause,
"You are an American, a nation which has blundered into European affairs without cause. You, monsieur, came to fight for France because you were born for the spirit of adventure, because you live upon excitement and have no fear. Is this not so?"
Roland thought he saw where the fellow was driving, but made no reply, for at this moment Tanya came into the room again, loaded her arms, and departed. "That's a correct statement," he smiled, "and I've surely found it here." He lowered the muzzle of the rifle a few inches more, and saw Kodkina's glance follow it. Kodkina leaned slightly forward.
"You are taking this money to a place of safety, you say.
That may or may not be. But you will not succeed in getting it out of Switzerland." "Why not?"
"Because it is a long way to the French border. You dare not go into Germany, and the arm of Nemi is long."
Roland looked aghast, and the muzzle of the rifle dropped still further. "I'm not afraid of the arm of Nemi, because," and he laughed, "it's my arm, monsieur." Kodkina paused a moment, shrugged his disbelief, and then in a lower tone,
"There is only one person who can help you get this money safely away, Monsieur Roland," he said.
"And he is?"
"Myself. The German border is less than 15 kilometers away. Once beyond it, I am safe. See."
And while Roland watched him closely, he thrust a hand into his pocket and drew out some papers, one of which bore signatures, a photograph, and a seal.
"My laissez-passer. And yours, monsieur, if you choose to accompany me."
Roland's eyes opened wider and his jaw fell. This was the real Kodkina, stripped to the skin that had been born Hochwald. But the American made no reply and waited for the revelation to be complete. Kodkina wasted no words, and his voice concentrated in a tense whisper.
"The money is negotiable,
and we'll have a broad highway from here to Holland.
If one knows the ropes.
You are not a rich man, monsieur.
Nor am I. Think what a great fortune like this means, even to you in America, where there are many great fortunes. You will be a prince. I, too. We will go together, and the world will lie at our feet. Is it not a wonderful picture?" Roland heard him through until the end, when the look of astonishment upon his face, indeed more than half real, changed to sterner lines, and the muzzle of the rifle slowly came up level with Monsieur Codequin's breast. "Why, you rascal," he growled sternly. "You pig, dog of a thieving Boche," he repeated deliberately. He paused a moment as Codquin straightened. "You're a poor conspirator, Herr Lieutenant Gregory Hochwald," he said with a malicious laugh, as Codquin gasped. "Hochwald of the Guard," he repeated. "Prussian Guard, 1906. Secret agent of General von Stromberg. Russian Socialist. Bah, Grisha Codquin, I've got your dossier. It's a sweet one." He paused in some satisfaction at the consternation he had created in the face of Monsieur Codquin, who was struggling hard to regain his composure. "My dossier, monsieur," he stammered, still staring incredulously. "You are mad." "Not so mad as I seem, nor so guileless, nor so even-tempered, Monsieur Codquin. I ought to kill you now as you stand and free Nemi of a spy and Russia of a traitor. But I won't. But I'll draw your sting." And then with a gesture, "March toward the door. Hands up." "What are you going to do?" "Wake Shestov and Bartu." "Ah, would you—" Roland fired as Codquin leaped back, crashing the light to the floor, and turned toward where he had been, firing again at random, cursing himself for his stupidity. The rifle was awkward in the confined space, and as he ran in the direction of the door of the vault to head the man off, his foot struck something on the floor and he stumbled against the shelves. When in desperation he found his way to the door of the vault, it clanged shut with a heavy crash, and he heard the tumblers falling into place. He was locked in, and Codquin had escaped. The nature of this disaster did not for a moment occur to him. He hammered on the unresponsive steel for an unreasoning moment, and then stopped to upbraid himself. "Silly fool," he muttered. "What did you go and do that for? You might have known. You can't shoot either. H of a soldier you are." Suddenly the terrible meaning of his position began to dawn upon him. The vault closed, with Codquin outside, and the combination of numbers that opened it unknown to anyone but himself. Unless Tanya. He put his ear to the steel door and listened. He thought he heard footsteps in the passageway outside and shouted her name. Silence. The darkness seemed to be closing in on him, like the silence, heavy, oppressive, burdened with meaning. A tomb. And unless Tanya contrived to find a way to come to his rescue, likely to be his own. And yet how could Tanya? He dared not follow his thought to its conclusion. Codquin would find her there in the darkness, and surely he would find her, for she would be coming back to the vault for him. Picard, Stepan, would they know what to do? And even if they knew what had happened, how would they be able to release him? One by one he thought of the various possibilities, and at the last was obliged to dismiss them all. He was caught, like a bear in a trap, and like the bear, raged to and fro for a while, knocking himself and breaking his knuckles against the shelves in the darkness, and cursing his own stupidity and the wits of Monsieur Codquin, which after all had proved cleverer than his own. Codquin had won,
Codkina, whom not 5 minutes ago he had been laughing at for his stupidity. Was it only 5 minutes, or was it an hour ago? This wouldn't do. No time to be getting rattled now. Bad business. Dark as the devil, too, but not hopeless. Nothing was entirely hopeless unless one thought it so. Something might happen. But what? Short of an earthquake that would tear the mound and vault to pieces, there seemed little chance of anything happening except Tanya, and Codkina would see about her. Roland was forced to admit that this was a beautiful vengeance for Codkina to discover, one quite fitting the Bough idea of the eternal fitness of things. To imprison a man, to starve him, to let him beat out his brains in madness against a steel wall, to smother him. Roland frowned into the darkness and whistled thinly. To smother him. The phrase seemed to have a new significance, the more terrible because of its simplicity. Suffocation, slow but certain, as he struggled for the exhausted oxygen. A matter of hours. The acid fumes of rifle and pistol smoke still hung in the air. Already he seemed to feel that breathing had become difficult. Imagination! He breathed quite easily and well. What time was it? Something after 2, perhaps. He didn't know. What he did know was that he was tired as the devil standing up, and that he wanted to sit down somewhere and have a smoke. He felt in his pockets. Cigarettes of the luckless Ivanich, and a box of matches. He struck a match and lighted a cigarette. The skull on the shelf grinned at him. Silly beggar, to grin on and on for 1,000 years. Happier, though. He always grinned when he could. It helped a lot. But he didn't seem to feel like grinning now. A thought came to him, and striking another match, he found the electric torch upon the steel floor, smashed this time beyond hope of use. He threw it away from him in disgust and sat down on the hard steel floor, his hands clasped over his knees, gazing at the light of the cigarette. It was a singularly cheerful spot of light in the denseness of the obscurity. Fool that he was, smoking here, poisoning the little oxygen that was left to him. Angrily he extinguished the cigarette upon the floor, and then clasped his knees with his aching fingers and sat uncomfortably waiting. Waiting for what? A miracle? Could anything be expected of Tanya? And even if she succeeded in eluding Codkina, how could he hope that she would know the numbers of the combination? He was sure that she had not even committed them to memory. And if she succeeded in reaching Shestov and Batu and telling them of his predicament, it would take a long while to break into the vault, at the end of which he, Roland, would be dead of suffocation. He got to his feet, steadying himself by holding to the shelves. In the darkness it seemed less easy to coordinate the movements of his muscles. Suffocation must be something like being gassed, only less painful. He had seen fellows in the hospital struggling for their breath, and remembered how they looked, livid, green. This was different, but it wasn't going to be pleasant. The pounding of his pulses seemed to echo in the still chamber. He moved slowly to one end of the room and reached upward. The ceiling was low. He could touch it easily with his fingers. Stupid to build a vault with a ceiling as low as that. What time was it? 4 o'clock? 5? It seemed as though he had lost all notion of the passage of time. Was it daylight outside? He walked around slowly, peering into the corners, seeking a glimpse of daylight. which would mean a breath of air for his lungs, and a respite, at least until starvation came. Everywhere blackness. The steel of the vault was continuous. Kirillo Ivanitch had planned well. Poor old Ivanitch. Good sort of a well-meaning lunatic. He was sorry for Ivanitch. But it hadn't been Roland's fault. If Ivanitch had only been Codkiner. Roland leaned against the gun rack and fingered the muzzles of the rifles. He had wanted to die out there in the open, with a weapon in his hand, rushing a trench and yelling "Vive la France!" That was the kind of a death for a good fellow. Oh, well, he'd had a good time. He had taken his fun where he found it. But it was rotten luck that he couldn't show Tanya that he had been worthy of her confidence. There was no use crying about it. Somebody might come and let him out. If they didn't, this was the end of P. Roland. He lay flat on the floor, where the air seemed very good. Might as well sleep as do anything else. Perhaps tomorrow something would turn up. The ceiling seemed to be closing in on him, like the pendulum in the pit. Poe was great on this sort of stuff, but Poe didn't have anything on him. Once or twice he straightened, thinking that he heard a sound, a dull sound, something like the throbbing of the blood in his ears, only imagination again. He didn't want to think. Everything was black. Even thought. He was very drowsy. It wasn't so bad after all. Tomorrow, perhaps, Tanya would come. Princess Tatiana. Pretty name. Then suddenly in his dreams the air was riven and his eardrums hurt him horribly, as though the blackness in his brain were striving toward the light. And then nothingness. End of chapter 8.